respected as equals together. That's what we're working for, and that's why we work with other groups who experience racism and oppression in this country to try and forge a broader line. So that's another reason why we're really pleased to be part of this now. The only way to fight racism is to have solidarity with each other. So often our society teaches how to divide, how to hate, how to blame somebody else. And together, our work, educational work, as well as stopping the fascists on the street, has to be to show that our diversity are not divisions. You know, in the same way, the other day, I think it was Stephen Pollard, who's the editor of Jewish Chronicle, who doesn't speak for us, he said, Mr. Trump, Mr. Corbyn. Now he mistakes populism for popular. Popular means everybody wants it. Populism is dividing people and sowing seeds of hate. So there's a real difference. Last November, I had, I'm not going to say it's a privilege, I went on a trip with 50 other people to Auschwitz, and the trip was organised by United Against Fascism. My family were from Poland, and I was the first member of my family to go back to Poland since the war, because nobody wanted to go and nobody talked about it in my family. So I found myself as one of 50 people from a real cross-section of society, people from every country, every nation in the country, every age group, religion. It was a really special occasion. It was a privilege to be in that group, and it was a privilege to be together and support each other, to go to Auschwitz and actually confront the loss, because that's a very hard thing to do. We all know that one of the reasons it's so hard to work around anti-racism is it does require us to engage with pain, loss, injury, death. They're very hard things. Human instinct is to step away from that and want to put it away. So it's very hard to engage. It was really good to be there and to confront that loss, but most important, what I came away with was not just the immensity of loss, that empty space full of visitors, but also that it wasn't the end results that was the most frightening, but the ever-present denial or the normalisation of hatred in everyday life that enabled that end to happen. And so we're at the bit where we have to stop it, nip it in the bud. Each incident of racism or hatred has to be challenged, however small it may seem, and obviously safely. When we think about how we fight racism, the image that comes up is fights on the street, Cable Street, men in boots and fights. I remember when we had a big march through Wood Green in the 70s, 77, I can't remember when it was, that might have been Lewisham 77, but it was violent. There were old people, there were young people, the kids in pushchairs, ordinary people from the estate where we lived. We went down there, and it was terrifying, and we were forced out, we couldn't. So we have to find ways to fight racism and stop the fascists in ways that engage everybody, not frightening, fighting on the streets. Of course, that's necessary sometimes, but also where we do that has to be deeply embedded in our communities and workplaces. So what we have to do, we're always looking at what we don't like. We're always talking about what racists are like, what fascists are like, what we hate about the Tories. We have to talk up what we want. Our vision, our dream of society is beautiful. It's positive. We have to talk about that, what we want. Everyone can see what they don't want, because it's human nature to not want it. Every day, in every community, the vast majority of people want security. They want safety. They want a meaningful life. They want love. We want intellectual pursuits. they're not things to be ashamed of. They're the common things that unite us, and that's where, for me, I believe, our most powerful and effective anti-racist work and anti-fascist work happens. Deeply embedded there, and we take away so that there can be no innocent bystanders, if you like. Everybody has a relationship with what they see on the TV and so on. So our common ground is that, and it's not shameful. You know, most of us, we talk about, well, political agendas. Most people aren't engaging with political agendas. It's having a reliable railway or a house that's decent, that engages people every day, and that's where our anti-racist struggle is built. That's where our alliances are built. You know, and personally, I would say from my experience, in our community, I live in a small rural town in Gloucestershire, just 8,000 people, and that approach works, engages people. So we don't walk away from people who don't vote or aren't registered. They're exactly the people we go and talk to. And we build relations, so nobody's left outside of society. You know, when a Jewish Socialist group talks about a strong society, we mean one not where we include minorities, but where diverse people and cultures are all integrated as equals. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. So it's flipping that way around. There are no minorities in a strong, integrated society. We're all equal and we're all respected. So, I don't know how I'm going to go. It's important not to be preyed on by guilt trips about Jews being, you know, constantly, you know, I think the appropriation of the memory of the Holocaust constantly, and using, we as Jewish people in this country are used as a battering ram to defeat the thing that we want, you know, a Labour government and the agenda we've got at the moment. There's one other thing I wanted to say. So I've said about our vision of how we fight fascism is to be not just, please dispatch that ideas just on the street, and think about education, think about our everyday relationships and how we build those individual interactions and communications into a movement. That's the key, isn't it? But you don't get social change unless we organise and have and show what solidarity looks and feels like, and always to be with the oppressed, never with the oppressor. Thank you.
Huge thanks, Miriam. Huge thanks for showing that level of solidarity with us. I'm not going to say much more, but to introduce you to our next, this country's next Justice Minister, Richard.
That's better, isn't it? Okay, I don't want to go losing my voice, but I want to start off by congratulating Stand Up to Racism for all they've done over the years, all they're doing now, and all they're going to do in the future as well. We need the biggest possible unity against racism and against fascism. I want to make 4 points today, really. 4 brief points, but I think important points. There is a view that racism and the appeal of racism is caused solely by an economic crisis or an economic crash. It's true that the appeal of racism and the appeal and the danger of the far right are increased by an economic crash of the sort that we saw 10 years ago, but it's not the only reason. If it were the only reason, it wouldn't have been the case that the BNP got 1 million votes as a fascist party before the economic crash. But the BNP did so well outside of the conditions of an economic crash, even though obviously the inequality of free market capitalism was obviously there. They did so well partly because the state itself had created a hostile environment with its friends and allies in that discourse in the right-wing media. And why did they do that? They did that in order to garner public support, or at least public acquiescence, with the imperial adventures abroad. The Islamophobia of those years helped to garner public support or lack of public opposition to the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan and elsewhere. So these things don't drop out of the sky. The economy plays an important role, but also the propaganda being put out by the state and the big business press on the right in relation to justifying their other policies at home and abroad. The ruling elite doesn't just need scapegoats, both domestically based and based abroad, just in periods of economic crisis. It actually needs them all the time. We've also got to be clear that racism is a gateway drug to fascism. I don't believe we should use the word fascist loosely, like Adrian Mole did in his diaries. If people read that, I think he thought his teacher was a fascist. I don't think his teacher was a fascist in actuality. He felt he was. We shouldn't use it loosely, but we should understand at the same time that racism is a gateway drug to fascism, which is why we must never go along with, justify, or make concessions to racist discourses and racist arguments. We should also recognise, by the way, that extremists are a minority in the working class. For example, the people marching in support of Tommy Robinson would be considered to be oddballs on the council estates I represent in Parliament. They are not representative of the majority of the working class in Leeds or anywhere else. And when we talk about the working class, let's talk about the working class in all its diversity. I do think that subconsciously people can fall into the trap of using analyses like, we've got to have a wide coalition against racism and fascism. Let's involve the working class, the black and minority ethnic communities. The black and minority ethnic communities are part of the working class. The vast majority of black and minority ethnic communities are 99%. So you've got to ensure that when we're building unity against fascism and its gateway drug, racism, we're getting unity amongst the working class as it looks like in the UK in 2018. So we've got to make sure of that. We also need to work with communities. If a trade union is in dispute or on strike, the first thing I do as a socialist is to go to that trade union and say, how can we support you best in your strike? What is the best type of solidarity, action and campaign we can work with you on? So in the same way, when it's racism, the gateway drug to fascism, and when it's fascism itself, we should first, as socialists, anti-racist, anti-fascists, go to the communities who are at the sharp end of the racist and fascist attack and ask them, how do you think we can best support you? Isn't that the principle of solidarity? And wouldn't that make it so much more of an effective anti-racist and anti-fascist campaign? But I'll finish on this. We're really lucky, well, it's not luck because you've all worked on it, but we're really lucky to have an anti-racist socialist as leader of the Labour Party, an anti-racist socialist as Chancellor, Shadow Chancellor, and an anti-racist socialist as the Shadow Home Secretary. We're really lucky to have that, although obviously it's a product of all our campaigns and all your campaigns over the years. Whilst the economic inequality in our society isn't the only reason for the causes of racism and the appeal of those ideas, if we had a socialist, anti-racist, pro-peace Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn, that would be a very important step in eradicating the appeal of these ideas. Because what I mentioned before, the way that these ideas before the economic crash had been used in order to garner support, or at least non-opposition, from as many people as possible to interventions in the Middle East, in Iraq, Afghanistan and elsewhere, we wouldn't be a government that would be pursuing those kind of foreign policies. We wouldn't be a government seeking to scapegoat migrants. And I think that Jerry put it very well. We spoke at the rally just over there on Saturday night. It was like a lifetime ago. Saturday night. On Saturday night, what's happened since then? He said, people can scapegoat minorities, they can blame this group or that group, but what have they achieved at the end of the day? It hasn't built a single council house. It hasn't got a single person into a decent, secure employment. It hasn't taken a single young person or old person out of poverty. And that's the goal that we have, isn't it? And when we achieve socialism in this country, when we have a socialist government, that will be a socialist government achieved by the working class majority, the 99% in all its diversity. And I will finish on this. A powerful image that you may have all seen. The so-called Democratic Football Lads Alliance. Lots of them seem a bit old to be described as lads. Maybe it's the Football Dads Alliance. I don't know, Football Granddads Alliance. Not that I'm against granddads or dads, obviously. That would be ageist. But we shouldn't presume the working class either, by the way, but that's another subject. I remember the very powerful image of a member of a trade union, a female Muslim bus driver, wearing the clothes that she wants to wear, which is her right, being surrounded by lots of angry members of the so-called Democratic Football Lads Alliance. I think that image shows you, doesn't it? What is the working class in Britain in 2018? Let's drop the silly ahistorical misunderstandings of that. If we understand class, we realise that class isn't about whether you speak as I do with a Leeds accent. Class isn't about whether you wear a flat cap as I don't. Class is about your relationship with the economic system, and that's why we're on the side of the working class in all its diversity. Thanks.
We've got a Justice Minister coming up representing the Labour Party in this way. And just to remind us, Richard speaks of the Football Lads Alliance. We know that they intend to march on the 13th of October. Well, we know what we are going to do, don't we? We are going to do a counter-protest on the 13th of October because we can't allow these football dads or granddads, as Richard indicated, to just simply march on the streets of Britain and have that freedom to do so in the face of such diversity. So we have to march in protest against them, to stand on the side of those that they seek to oppress. And we have to demonstrate that and show that we mean business. Because, you know, when you are living daily, your lives in Britain face daily with racism, and your skin colour is such that it's a daily experience. Well, I think for one day we can come out and stand in solidarity with people who face this level of racism, heightened and increased level of racism daily. We can come out on the 13th of October and stand in solidarity in protest against this so-called Football Lads Alliance. And how dare they use the national sport of football to debase the UK in this way and debase our lives in this way. So we'll stand in protest against them. Our final speaker is Steve Hart. And of course, Steve represents and reflects Stand Up to Racism and Unite Against Fascism, and he's going to round up our panel of speakers today. Steve Hard.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and I think we've had some fantastic speakers today that have talked in some depth about the nature of the alliance that we require to defeat fascism and racism, and also the nature of the problem. I just do want to re-emphasise the critical moment we're in. I've been involved in fighting fascism. Let's calculate. 51 years was the first anti-NF demo I went on, 51 years ago. Like my father was at Cable Street. And I've been doing this for a long time. But never have I felt so afraid of the future developments. You know, we fought them in the 70s. With the ANL, the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism, we had a mass movement, a broad movement involving the left, the Labour movement, and much wider than that defeated the National Front in very difficult circumstances. And we did it on the streets, but we also did it, and the crucial moment was Rock Against Racism, that brought the cultural element, that reminded people about the pleasure of diversity in society, so that racism, which had been and fascism had been getting this certain coolness among some aspects of the NF, suddenly people were very, very clear. This is fascism, it's horrible, and we're going to defeat it. And the tens of thousands of people that marched and attended Rock Against Racism festivals and went back to their schools, went back to their workplaces. That was a moment the National Front got defeated in those days. We did it again with the EDL. Some said we should ignore them. We didn't. We said, where they're there in numbers, we will be out there showing that there are more people opposed to them than they claim to support. Where they want to disrupt minority communities, when they want to march through Tower Hamlets, no, you're not doing that, we said. And the police said, oh yes, they are. And we said, oh no, you're not. And did they? No, they didn't, because the community massively turned out. The Muslim community, Jews, Christians, the trade union movement in Tower Hamlets turned out, and we turned back the EDL. And the EDL went into decline, and they more or less disappeared through their own splits. But now what we're faced with this international movement. It is a movement of fascism, with Steve Bannon acting like a latter-day Comintern agent of the far right, organising them and funding them. This is a very, very difficult time for us. And we, as people have said, we have the Democratic Football Lads Alliance. Now, the Democratic, they're mainly been thrown out of their football grounds, and they're not lads, and by the way, there's nothing wrong with granddads. But I was on the first big one was it June, July? The first big one in Whitehall. And there weren't many of us there. And I tell you, that was terrifying. I've been on many demonstrations. That was the first time that we were surrounded by police horses. But it was the arses of the police horses that we saw, because they were protecting us. And we needed them, because they were going to attack us. And there weren't very many of us. The next one, there were far more of us. And we felt proud to be standing there, proud to be on the telly as well, saying, we are ordinary, decent people, we reject that fascism. Although down the end of the road, who was speaking? A US Republican senator spoke. That obnoxious character from Breitbart was speaking. This was the international fascism speaking just down the road. And they are evil people. I mean, they're not normal people. You look at them. They are thugs. They really are thugs. It's quite scary that movement is developing. And they're going to be there on October the 13th again. So we do need to reflect on what's worked in the past and and how we can recreate that in the modern circumstances. There are a couple of points I want to say about what doesn't work. We really need to emphasise this. I think Diane was fantastic in her remarks about immigration. She's been on many of these platforms, she's been with Stand Up to Racism all the way through. And in the past, she's always been arguing for a really good progressive immigration policy. And now she's the one writing it. I mean, it's just a pleasure. It really is fantastic. But on immigration, we need to be clear. Some people will say it's a big issue locally. It's a big issue. We've got to be careful. We've got to pull back. No, we say what's right about immigration. Immigration is good for all of us. Immigration does not drive down wages. It doesn't We know it doesn't drive down wages because people have done all the research. It doesn't. You know, some people like to think it does, but it doesn't. And it doesn't affect public services. It's austerity that's driven down public services. And we need to make these points. Never flinch, never give an inch to a false argument. Tell the truth about these things. The other thing, which is a little bit more difficult to say, I think Richard was really good on this point. You don't defeat fascism by fighting austerity. Of course we need to fight austerity. And of course it is the circumstances of austerity, especially since 2008, that's eased the development of fascism and racism. But of itself, it doesn't defeat fascism or racism. Indeed, we can take lessons, if you like, from Nazi Germany. They had the most radical policies on offer in Nazi Germany. But it didn't defeat fascism. What defeats fascism and racism is fighting racism, dealing with the racism, the gateway drug, as Richard put it, dealing with it in a positive way, fighting for diversity. When a racist incident happens, campaign around it. Look at the whole Windrush thing. Something that all of us ought to be ashamed of, frankly, for not raising early enough and allowing things to happen. But when people like Diane, people like David Lammy and others really got on the bandwagon about it, building what was being written in The Guardian, the progressive majority that is there in Britain expressed itself. People don't like that kind of thing. There is a progressive majority against racism in Britain, but we need to express it and we need to argue it at every level. And it is about in schools. It's about at every level. I mean, for me, when you know you're winning the argument on racism is when your child comes home from school and they've got henna on their hands. Yeah. Because the teacher is telling them about different religions, different cultures, and they're all enjoying it. And it's when the people picking up their kids from nursery and primary school, when there's mixing and people are talking and people are going to each other's parties, that's where the first defeat of racism happens. And it's that kind of thing that's got to be done. But you have to take on racism. You can't ignore it. You can't swallow and say, well, it's the white working class. There isn't such a thing as a white working class, as Richard said. We fight racism where we see it at every opportunity, and that's what Stand Up to Racism is all about. So, we need to confront these racists, these fascists on the street. That needs to be done. When they seek to organise in a community, when there are large numbers of them seeking to come in to intimidate people, then we have to be there to show that we, the progressive majority in this country, are the majority. We need to do that. We don't go chasing them when they're 5 and 10 at a street corner. No, we don't go chasing them in that way. But when there's significant mobilisation of them, we need to be there to show them more of us. And we need to be doing the cultural activities, promoting diversity, building the unity against them. Because building unity is absolutely key. It was again the lesson of the 30s, what didn't work and what did work. We need the broadest unity. Fascism needs to be surrounded by a cordon sanitaire. And that's one of the problems that's happened lately, is that that has been weakened. We need to rebuild that unity if people are against fascism as far as we possibly can. Now, all of these things don't happen by accident. We do need to build a great movement. And we think that Stand Up to Racism, in reality, is the only organisation around who's campaigning in that way, on the ground, local and national. There are others like Hope Not Hate that do good work, but not in the same way of organising. And if there isn't a Stand Up to Racism locally, or it's isolated, or your constituency isn't involved with it, it's not as strong as it could be. And that's what we're saying to you. You need to be involved. We need the structure of this organisation in order to fight and effectively defeat racism and fascism. So we invite all of you, not just to turn up to the Old Bailey, I think it's Thursday, isn't it, where Mr. Robinson hopefully will be hearing from the judge some very clear words. Not just on October the 13th, where we need to be in Whitehall, wherever it is, we think it's Whitehall, in massive numbers. We need to be there in large numbers at the conference we've got on the 20th of October that's got Diane Abbott, John Donnell and many others. talking about how we defeat racism and fascism. We need you at the November 17th demo. We need you at our annual event on UN Anti-Racism Day, which is next March. We need you on all of those events, but we need you organising locally to make these events on a scale that hitherto we haven't reached. We need to be absolutely massive, because there's a progressive majority in this country. There is, but it needs to be mobilised, and it's only you, and you, and you that can do that. And that's only if you're involved in Stand Up to Racism, in your local groups and nationally. Please do that.
Thank you, Steve. Brilliant. We've got a bit of time for a few questions, statements from the audience. I just want to say that when we're talking about mobilising in defeat of racism and fascism, we obviously realise and recognise that we've got a new form of racism and fascism. Fascism has always been there, but it's really explicit now, and that's state-sanctioned racism and fascism. That's what the Windrush hostile environment was all about. So our game is great, our resolve has to be greater. I'll take lady back there with red earrings. I love red earrings.
Each time we run these, we had a spike in hate crime. And one of the big spikes in hate crime we've had is amongst children in our communities and in schools. The rise in hate between our children. And you made a good point that communities are working together when children are going to each other's parties, regardless of what background or race or religion that they come from. And one of the big correlations that is being ignored in this country is when Sure Start centres were taken away and early years funding was taken away, there was a huge rise in hate crime. You can see it statistically very, very clearly, and this is because that is when professionals and community organisations were engaging with parents and carers and children when they were together in an organic situation. It wasn't about putting on activities where we bought purposely, almost saying something is wrong, so let's all eat each other's food together and have some. That's saying something's wrong, let's have a community event to put that right. We were organically just all doing the same things at the same time, and that's what works. That's what takes down those barriers, and we need to bring that funding back and start right at the beginning with our babies and children, and make everybody equal and give everybody those services, and stop putting almost sort of identifying a problem and making it a problem before it's even begun, because those kind of events make it a problem. That's what I want to say.
Thank you. Can you pass that to the gentleman here in the brown jacket? That's you, sir.
Oh yes, Mick from Harlow Defeat Council Housing. We spoke about the economic crisis. I mean, yeah, very much. Right, okay, yeah. Very much, the housing policies in the last 30 years has driven racism. I've been, on the streets and rallies and demonstrations, for council housing. But on the streets and knocking on doors, it's brought up time and time again. That migrants are responsible for the housing crisis. Absolute nonsense. We all know that. We know they sold off the homes and kept their money. We do need the council house building to fight that. So thank you.
Thanks, comrade. And sister behind you, just here. Yeah, great.
Hi, I'm Angeline. I'm from Broadford, CLP, where we've got a real issue with racism, and we don't have UKIP anymore. We got rid of them. We don't have BNP. We have a real brand of Tory. And many people may have seen the leaflet that they put out during the local elections. It went national. David Lammy came out and spoke against it, talking about keeping Havering special, not looking like an East, in a London slum. And they absolutely struck the board during the local elections. All of the Romford seats went to Tories who were putting this material out. And I guess I don't know what else to say to people on the doorstep when we're knocking on the doors and people are saying, I'll vote for whoever gets rid of all the foreigners and brings back the death sentence. And that's common. And my 6-year-old is coming home from school saying that other children are telling her she's not allowed to play with her Muslim friends. And I need some more ideas, I guess, on how we can start tackling that on a really small level so that we can start to change that narrative.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Sister right back there.
Oh, hi, it's Barbara Campbell from Stockton North. Some of it is just about information and some of it is asking some advice. This isn't just a London problem, this is happening across the whole country. We've heard a lot about rallies in London. Over the last 6 weeks in the North East, we've had the far right out on the streets 5 out of 6 weeks. They're not marching as the far right, they're adopting other identities. They're talking, they're calling themselves Justice for Women Against Rape, they're calling themselves Gays Against Sharia, and these are all things deliberately to confuse the public about why they're there. But you scratch the surface, and it is that racism, that entry drug that Richard talked about into fascism. These people are on our streets every week, so partly it's asking the panel some advice about how do we actually counter those arguments, but also asking people to don't be a bystander, don't wait until there's a rally to be an anti-racist. If you see someone being abused in the street, if you hear kids talking, racist talk and telling someone they can't play with a Muslim child, challenge them, do it in a friendly way, but actually please don't be a bystander.
Thank you, sister.
Sam Bishop from Congleton, CLP. A couple of things. One, just that myth about Rock Against Racism in 1978, that it was the presence of 50,000 people in the park to kill the National Front off. And there was huge arguments on the day because the National Front were marching 2 miles down the road, and the carnival organisers refused to direct people to that. But no, some people did go down there, and that made a huge impact. But I think we have to use a whole range of different measures, because I think the colleague there from Stockton said that they are very good at picking up low-level, not quite racist issues, and then bringing people in. We've got an issue in our work in Stoke-on-Trent, this issue around people making complaints about taxi drivers, and there's a new website come up called Stoke-on-Trent Incidents, SOTI. When we looked, it's the same as Stoke-on-Trent Infidels, who are the local far-right racist group. And I think we need to be very open to being able to how we can challenge people who... It's like the number of people who post Britain First things up without actually knowing about it. They're very good at drawing those people in. So we need to find some strategy to try and address that. Those people who aren't racist, but then gradually get pulled in. Yeah. And it makes the support seem a lot bigger than it actually is, because a lot of those people who repost Britain First aren't racist in any way and are horrified when you tell them. And then Britain First has got 1 million people on their website at one time. So
we need to be exposing all of this. Can I bring this gentleman in here in the black t-shirt in? Yes, comrade.
Hi, my name is James Griffiths. I'm an ex-football hooligan, and now I work with Stand Up to Racism to engage people outside football grounds and football pubs on away days and home games to try and sort of turn them away from being recruits to Tommy Robinson and his friends, educate them about the backers to the DFLA and FLA, the Middle East Forum, Banham, and it's been mostly positive in most of the pubs that we've been to, a couple of dissenters, but it's groundwork that needs to be done. It's quite intimidating, but we go mixed. There's probably 6 or 7 of us out most Saturdays. We do Bristol Rovers, City, we do Cardiff, Newport, and we're obviously trying to expand it, and it's working. And we've got some really positive feedback, and we've engaged with the clubs locally as well. So I'd say to anyone with a football club in your town, you will get a decent response, and I think it's something worth looking at doing if you're not doing it already. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm hoping everybody who wants to speak will have an opportunity to do so. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Chris Curiati from Sally Oak in Birmingham. 37 years ago this week was my